Gentlemen, you've been brought here not because you're the best, but because we are in a time of great need. And frankly, you're all that we have.
Thank you, sir. But can I ask what we're here to do?
The world is in great danger. Every day there is a buildup of more and more float questions, and we're in desperate need of some answers. You'll begin training immediately. Honing your voices, learning to balance a microphone in your hand, spending every day in and around Epsom salt until you can catch a grain dropping out of the air. You gentlemen are going to start a podcast.
Red leather, yellow leather. Red leather, yellow leather. Red leather.
Welcome to our podcast.
Welcome to our
Welcome
podcast.
to our podcast.
Welcome to our podcast.
Podcast.
My name is Ashkahn.
My name is Ashkahn.
My name is Ashkahn.
My name is Graham. My name is Graham.
God.
Graham.
This microphone
Graham.
is heavy.
Graham.
See,
Graham.
why are these
Graham.
always so heavy? But we're not ready. I don't think we can do it. I've never done this before.
We're just gonna have to make everything up.
I think you can actually drink pH+.
If you install the door on the ceiling of your float cabin, then you never have to worry about salt getting out.
Sometimes physically pushing your customers is okay.
I'll put a little bit of Epsom salt on my food from time to time.
I'm pretty sure the filter is just for aesthetics.
It's best to keep your entire lobby pitch black to ease people into the float experience.
Sometimes you just need to climb into the tank with your customers.
Go out right now and purchase a solid glass neck pillow.
I'd say you can only fit, like 15 people max in your standard float tank?
Never make eye contact.
Never listen to the health department. They're a rogue, pseudo-governmental department without any actual authority.
The ideal wake-up track is European police sirens.
And if you have any more questions, go to floatanksolutions.com/podcast.
Good work, boys. And just remember, there's another one of these to record tomorrow. And every day. Forever. All right.
Hey, welcome.
Hey
Welcome,
there,
everybody. Hey.
audience. I am Graham.
And I am Ashkahn.
And today's question for you is, what is chamber rest? I've heard you mention it before, and I'm unsure of the details.
Yeah. Chamber rest.
REST. I guess that's also how the other one is spelled. Capital R, capital E, capital S, capital T. Yeah.
So, okay, let's quick recap. That stands for, well, it's mostly restricted environmental stimulation therapy, although sometimes you hear reduced environmental stimulation therapy.
Yeah.
And it was a term coined by Peter Sudfeld and Rod Borey back in the early days of research into, what everyone was calling sensory deprivation back then, to try to create kind of a friendlier / more accurate term for that sort of research. So kind of when you talk about rest, it covers a number of different types of things, including what we, float tanks as we know them, these things called dry float tanks, and what is called chamber rest. And they're all basically kind of variations on a theme.
Yep. And so you'll sometimes hear chamber rest in distinction with flotation rest or float rest. Is kind of usually how it's described.
And dry rest, I guess.
Yeah. Which is kind of like almost dry float rest, I guess, is kind of what that's
like. Or like very small chamber rest.
Sure. Yeah. But yeah, mainly chamber rest and flotation rest are kind of two distinctive things. There are even some studies that kind of cross over between both of them, which is kind of cool. And chamber rest, you saw more back in the day. Like the research at some point, I feel like, kind of transitioned from being mostly chamber rest studies coming out to being mostly flotation rest studies coming out.
Yeah, so if you may have come across those crazy pictures of like a guy with his arm in cardboard tubes lying on a bed that are like grainy and from the 60s.
It's in our About Float Tanks guide too. So if you go and Google just, About Float Tanks guide, and download that from the website, you can see some cool old photos of rest history.
So the
basic
basic concept is the same idea of trying to remove all sensory stimulation from someone. So completely dark, completely quiet, and even trying to remove physical stimulation by like wrapping people's bodies and things to not allow them to even like feel their own body making contact with itself. So there was no water or salt or anything like that. You'd get into a whole room, and this room would be made to be quiet and dark, and you'd put
In a pretty small room, like
pretty small room, not huge. There'd be a bed in there.
Yeah, and people would spend
probably a
most of their
bathroom.
time laying down.
Yeah, I think like a desk or something for you to sit on sometimes, and yeah. So I mean, the ways that people would like have stuff wrapped around their body varied. It ranges from those like crazy, like literally cardboard tubes with like cotton around your fingers and arms and stuff like that, to sometimes I think people weren't wrapped in anything
Or
at
as
all.
I like to call it, my
just,
usual pajamas.
it was just about being, by themselves in the room. And certainly like the modern chamber rest stuff, I don't think involves like wrapping people's bodies in anything. I think it's just a dark, quiet
Yeah,
stuff.
they were really trying to get to that point of like neutral feeling, but without going the water route, like the water air temperature route as much.
So this stuff, I mean, some of this research was from before like wet flotation even existed. I think like if back in like the day, this is the stuff that's kind of like weirdly mixed in sometimes with that like MK Ultra and like government research and like quote unquote brainwashing sort of stuff. When you hear about this kind of like overlap of sensory deprivation and things like that, sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're talking about like weird, crazy, like playing insane white noise at people for like hours at a time.
And it's a good distinction too. Like that stuff is usually labeled as sensory deprivation research, which is cool. Same thing. It's on our research list. If you Google the research list, flotation research list, you'll turn it up. And same thing on there. It actually goes back to even the early days of the general published. Some of it's behind governmental walls and stuff like that, so you can't get at it. But at least published early sensory deprivation research predates even the first float tank that John Lilly invented.
And then there was a transition. There was a separate kind of amount of this chamber rest research that was being done that was not associated with brainwashing or any of that sort of stuff. And at the time got a really bad rap for even just the like perception of its association. I think the researchers back in the day had a very difficult time with public perception with this, while they were doing things that were showing great results and helping people. But some of the earliest research and some of the studies that you think are about floating actually are about chamber rest. Like you got to kind of look at them. Like the studies about helping people quit smoking were chamber rest studies.
And one other big thing too, which is important to note as we're kind of getting into talking about the studies too, is just length of time that people spend in these devices. So a typical float is 60 to 90 minutes. Typical research time in a chamber rest kind of whatever it is, not cell, but chamber rest study.
Room?
Chamber? Chamber rest chamber would be around 24 hours was the usual length that they'd be in there. And certainly rarely less than 12 hours or something like that. So we're talking much longer term exposure to that environment.
And some of the results they had successful data from, like smoking cessation and chamber rest, they couldn't replicate in float tanks. But, again, that to me, at least, I think our opinion is that time is a big factor there. Like having someone 24 hours in one of those and then throwing them for 1 hour into a float tank and not seeing the same results across some of the things.
Yeah, it seems like kind of not a fair.
It just seems like a huge variable.
Test,
But, there was a lot of that. Like there was chamber rest research facilities set up at a couple universities back in the day. And then for a long time, there really wasn't anything. There wasn't chamber rest going on for many, many years until recently when somehow in the Czech Republic, this popped back up as a thing. An actual chamber rest facility opened there, and it started to become really popular. I think some celebrity there made it famous and did it and spread it, and now there's these chamber rest centers. Floating is not a huge thing there yet, but there's these chamber rest facilities that are popping up where people book these retreats to go be in them for 2 to 3 weeks or a month or much longer periods of time. So they're in there and there is a little desk and they have food brought to them and there's a bed and a bathroom and all that sort of stuff, and they'll be in there for weeks at a time, and these places get booked up for months ahead of time with these chamber rest facilities, and they're starting to do some new chamber rest research out of there too.
Don't they call it something else too?
They call it darkness therapy.
Yeah. Well, there's this big flotation or, flotation rest kind of resurgence going on in the U.S. and Canada and Australia. Over there in the Czech Republic, chamber rest is on the rise. It's crazy.
There's a conference. One of like the main researchers from there came and spoke at the conference a couple years ago. His name is Marek Malus. It's spelled Marekmalus. So you can find that conference video. And
and we'll link it in the show notes too.
And if you want to learn more about what's going on over there in the Czech Republic and the research they're doing and stuff like that. But outside of that, like I don't know of any specifically chamber rest stuff that's happening in the U.S. or I don't know of any like facilities really in the U.S.
Yeah, so if you know of anything, send it in. But also as far as I'm aware, it's even as of like the kind of going into the late 80s and 90s, it's very much like not happening as much,
Uh-huh. And then there's dry flotation, which is basically kind of like a float tank. It's the same like general size as a float tank, and the concepts of light-proof, soundproof, all that's the same across all of these. And basically the difference is the salt water is in a giant bladder. So it's kind of like a waterbed, except it's much looser. So you really like sink into it in the same way that you would sink into water. And there's still salt water in there. Apparently they tried it with normal water, and you would like hit the bottom too easily of the device. So they had
the
to
salt
put
water actually
salt.
The buoyancy still kind of does the same thing, even contained in a bladder, which still doesn't quite make sense to my brain in the physics of how that works. But I guess
the salt water it's heated. The devices are the dry flotation tanks are soundproof, and you put them in a light-proof room and stuff like that. So it's pretty much like floating, except there's a membrane between you and the liquid. So it's just a little I guess like easier to get in and out of. You don't have to shower and deal with all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and there's some studies on that too, which you can look up. Mostly run by Arid Barabaj.
Yeah,
is the researcher.
Yeah, he's had a lab set up at the university that he works for in Pullman, Washington for years, decades. Yeah, quick little side note here. We happen to own we own one of these.
Yeah.
Ari really he was retiring and closing his lab down, and he's had this research like dry tank in there for decades, and he was trying to find something to do with it, and he talked us into buying it off of him, even though we have no idea what to do with it or where to set it up. So if you're listening to this and you want to buy a dry tank, please get in touch with us.
Yeah, reach out. We'll cut you a good deal on it.
It's a really nice, very nice model.
The wood is fancy. Cured with this lemon oil.
Lemon oil. It's
it is
nuts,
actually
man.
really
There's
nice.
sand
really nice.
There's wood paneling that makes this whole thing, and the wood is filled with sand
so
as an insulator.
Move.
Yeah, I mean, this was an insane thing that we had to go deconstruct.
The cool thing that came as a result of this, though, was that we got to go out to Pullman to actually help Arid tear down his lab, which means we not only got to see this dry tank kind of set up in the original lab where the research is being run, but he still had a chamber rest room.
Just casually, like down the hall.
Yeah.
He just mentioned to us, he's like, oh yeah, like the chamber rest room down there. And I was like, wait, say that again? Like you still have a chamber restroom? He's like, yeah, it's just been there for all these years. And we go and look at it and like legit.
Still had the bed in it,
yeah,
still had like
bed.
little blackout goggles and an intercom, which I convinced him to give me. So I also have an intercom for one of the original chamber rest researchers if I'm not getting rid of that one there. So I'll throw it in with the dry tank if you guys decide that you.
Yeah, but they do some really interesting stuff with it. He was telling us about a study he ran in the chamber rest room where they were trying to see if it could curb addiction of foods. And so they got like other professors in the university to like go and like they had someone who had just like a weakness for wine and chocolate. And this professor, they had them go into the room and they just fed them like through the wall supplies of wine and chocolate the entire time to see if just that like overabundance of it in that environment made them just sick of it. And it did. They were like, okay. And they didn't for a long time, like definitely did not consume as much of it.
Yeah,
so interesting stuff they've done back in the day. And I think Arid even like went down to Antarctica to do some of this research. He did like isolation research down in Antarctica, and in along the same vein as this sort of idea of chamberless, like taking people and putting them into isolation in a part of the world that was extremely isolated, and ran research on it.
And he talks a little bit about that too, I think, in his conference talk that he gave.
Yeah.
Specifically the Antarctica stuff too. So yeah, if you're interested in hearing it from his mouth, he's just a really cool guy too.
Yeah.
Like it's well worth just watching his talk for his crazy stories.
Yeah. So more than anything, when you're looking into float research, pay attention. It's easy to glance over when you don't know that there's these like 3 separate methods really of research that have been done over the years, and you'll be surprised to find that a lot of research from the 80s and 70s, when you look at it, you're like, oh, this was in a dry tank, or oh, this was like chamber rest. There's, when you go back to that sort of era of research, it's all over the place. It's almost like a third. I mean, the float research didn't even start until Tom Fine and John Turner started doing it in like the very end of the 70s or early 80s or something.
I think that'd be the earliest float research, yeah.
So there was years before that of research where that like wet float tanks were not even a part of it. It was all just dry tanks and chamber rest, and mostly chamber rest for that beginning part. So a good thing to keep an eye out for.
And another reason to go check out the research list if you haven't recently is that as of 2018, we actually have another column in there that labels all of the studies for whether they were chamber rest, dry rest, float rest, sensory deprivation, or some combination of those.
Yeah.
So it's really easy to just kind of sort and actually get a sense for what research was going on at what time and stuff like that, which is actually probably my favorite change that we've made to that.
That's the research list for some context. Sometimes we're bad at giving context about stuff like this.
Yeah, it's true. We just sort of
on floatanksolutions.com, we have a full list of scientific research that is broken down in a spreadsheet.
I'm Graham.
Yeah, my name's Adam. You're listening to the Daily Solutions Podcast.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that's what chamber rest is.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. Definitely a fun thing to dig into someday.
And if you have your own questions that you want us to answer, go to floatanksolutions.com/podcast and ship them on over.
That's right. It'll ship right over to us and we'll answer them.
As we do with all ships.
Yeah. All right. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Bye, everyone.